Last week, President Trump made this announcement.
A short while ago, President Trump signed three items. The first is an executive order relating to the affordability and availability of in vitro fertilization and other fertility treatments. These are treatments that have become unaffordable for many Americans, or have been unaffordable for many Americans. And the executive order is a directive to the Domestic Policy Council to examine ways to make IVF and other fertility treatments more affordable for more Americans.
And a bunch of people are feeling a bunch of different ways about it. I wrestled with the idea of whether or not I should even make this video, but I've done a deep dive on this subject before, and I feel like my position isn't broadly represented. So strap in. This is probably going to be a longer video. Hi folks, I'm Paul, and this is my take. Being a Christian, being right-wing, being pro-life, I'm often in agreement with a large majority of the popularly held positions and opinions within the conservative sphere. But I think I deviate a little bit from the norm when it comes to this issue. Not because I think that the majority of the people on the right wing are necessarily wrong when it comes to this. I think they're correct in about 80 to 90% of their understanding of this issue. But I think the 10 or 20% that they're missing leads them to maybe draw some of the wrong conclusions. Of course, this is a touchy subject, and I'm still working through my complete understanding and opinion on it. And of course, I'm willing to consider the fact that I might be wrong about some of these things. So if you have an angle that I'm not bringing up, maybe a piece of information that I don't mention, and you would like to add more clarity to the topic, please share your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to have the broadest view possible on this topic. The way I see it, IVF has received a lot of negative attention, especially from the pro-life side of the right wing. And for good reason. I think in its current state, the treatment is being horribly abused. The problem, though, is I think a lot of pro-lifers have an incomplete picture of what it is, why it was developed, and how it can be done. And in calling for a complete ban of IVF, I think a lot of people are throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Pun intended. Now, I don't take the position that it should be expanded. I don't agree with a lot of what is in this new executive order. But I also don't take the position that it should be entirely abolished either. I am in the seemingly tiny, broadly ignored camp of individuals who believe the practice should be reformed. Now, what does that mean? I think that the treatment, who it's available to, and how it's performed can and should be changed, but not done away with entirely. I'll rattle off the criteria of who it should be available to, and then we'll dig into why. IVF should only be an option to couples if it is the last resort for their opportunity to conceive. That couple must be heterosexual and married, and only 1 or 2 embryos should be created at a time, and both must be implanted before another cycle can continue. So, why is it only as a last resort? Because 1, it comes with a ton of ethical considerations, and we'll get into that a little later into the video. But 2, if there's an underlying cause to health issues, like lifestyle, obesity, things like that, it's generally a good idea to try to address those issues before moving on to more involved treatments. Why only a heterosexual married couple? Is it because I hate gay people? No, I don't hate anyone. I just believe the best conditions for the bearing and raising of children is when a mother and father are in a committed and loving relationship with one another, namely a marriage. And I think it's wrong to intentionally deprive a child of a parent of both sexes. No matter how hard we might try, a man can never do a mother's job, and a mother can never do a father's. And a child needs to be supported by both. Why only 1 or 2 embryos at a time? Because the creation of more runs the severe risk of a majority of those children being frozen, which is morally gray and wrong at worst, or at absolute worst, it runs the severe risk of those children being destroyed. If created only 1 or 2 at a time and both are implanted, every life that is created receives the opportunity to grow and form into a child. Now, under this criteria, IVF becomes more expensive and more time-consuming than it already is. But it eliminates nearly every moral problem that most people have with the procedure. And if we can clear up the moral problems, I don't see why we can't be arguing for reform instead of arguing for a total ban. And nearly every argument I see in favor of total abolition of IVF is often accompanied by an incomplete or misrepresented understanding of the treatment. And this misunderstanding condemns certain aspects of the treatment that could be fixed in calling for reform. Let's go through some of the most common arguments that I see a lot of people making. It commodifies life. What do people mean when they say this? A commodity is something that can be bought and sold. And this is true. In its current state, IVF is available to a lot of people that abuse the treatment. A gay couple can pay a woman to carry a child for 9 months, and then they take that child, intentionally depriving the child of its mother. And I think that's bad. I don't think that should happen. And under a reformed practice, a requirement for eligibility of this treatment would be that a child would need to be a product of a married couple comprised of a man and a woman. IVF was created as a fertility treatment. It was created for couples who, under normal circumstances, would be able to create a family without any kind of medical assistance. A husband and a wife, a man and a woman, under normal circumstances, should be able to do that. But in cases where they can't, IVF is a treatment and not seen as a commodity. 2 women or 2 men, under normal circumstances, will never be able to form a child together. So in those cases, it's a commodity and not a treatment. If we want to combat that aspect of IVF, which I think we should be specific about what we mean when we say it commodifies life. It's unnatural. This is not an argument, and it's really only effective against people who don't really want to think very hard about the topic. It's an appeal to nature, which assumes that just because something is natural means that it is inherently good, or because something is unnatural, it's inherently bad. And I'm sorry, but that's kind of dumb. There are a million natural things that are bad. Snake venom is natural. Tooth cavities are natural. And nobody is arguing that those things are good on account of their natural aspects. And on the other hand, things like antibiotics are unnatural. Would we argue against the proper use and medical administration of antibiotics on account of its unnaturalness? And the step beyond this argument, the more considered argument, is it separates the creation of life from the conjugal act. It removes conception from man and woman coming together. Now, this is a much better argument, but I don't think it proves the point it sets out to make. This suggests that the removal of sex from life creation is morally wrong. And I'm not necessarily saying that that's untrue, but I am saying that that's not necessarily supported. You need to go further than just saying it removes the creation of life from the conjugal act. You need to explain why that's wrong, and I haven't heard that. Much like the address to the first argument, under normal circumstances, a healthy heterosexual couple should be able to form a life through natural ways. But for whatever reason, circumstances aren't always normal, and that's why treatments exist. The conjugal act is separated from conception in these cases, because without doing that, you wouldn't get the outcome of the reproductive act. The same sorts of things can be said about many medical interventions. Glasses. In ideal circumstances, everyone would have 20/20 vision. But for whatever reason, some of us have bad eyesight. And we wouldn't argue that glasses being an external, unnatural remedy to our poor eyesight is bad. We wouldn't say that the use of glasses separates the act of looking from clarity. And I know it's not a one-to-one comparison. There is still the element of man and woman needing to bond in order to form a life. And the argument is that it removes man and woman coming together to do that. But when you reason through it, it's still, on a cellular level, man and woman coming together, albeit in a way that nobody would really prefer, but in a way that otherwise, for whatever reason, wouldn't be possible. And I've yet to hear an argument how anyone can definitively prove that that is morally wrong. It destroys more life than it creates. This is another argument that is true, but it's also supported by an incomplete understanding. In its current form, yes, this happens a lot, and it shouldn't. In its current form, IVF creates a large number of embryos, often between 10 and 20. They're graded on scales of which is most likely to result in a successful pregnancy, and then the highest rated one is implanted, and the rest are either frozen for later use or destroyed From a pro-life perspective, yeah, there is a lot that is absolutely heinous about that. If, like we believe, life begins at conception, then just with IVF, there is a daily Holocaust occurring. But I see a lot of people making this argument essentially saying that this is the only way that it can ever be done, and because of that, it's entirely irredeemable and it must be done away with entirely. And that's incorrect. People don't want to seem to talk about the fact that it can be done in ways where every child that is created is given a shot at life. Granted, like I said, it's more expensive and it takes longer, but it can be done. And if we call for reform, this can be an element of how it should be done, how it should be required to be done. I see a statistic floating around that says something about roughly 85% of the life that's created through IVF is destroyed. And as a pro-life movement, I think it's good that we fight to reduce that 85%. But also being pro-life, I think we should also be fighting to get that 15% higher. That 15% is life. Those are babies being born. And I don't think they get enough consideration when people are having these kinds of arguments. There's an elevated chance of miscarriage. Not to sound callous, but so? Do we make this argument for couples who can naturally conceive but are at maybe a higher risk of miscarriage? Do we moralize that? Miscarriage is terrible. It's tragic no matter what the circumstance. But it's an unfortunate reality of our fallen world. Children die in pregnancy, even in cases where that isn't necessarily at an elevated risk of happening. And it's true, this is an element that should be considered by all couples, regardless of how they form their families, but these are ethical considerations and not necessarily moral ones. The life created by it is at a higher risk of defects and health problems. Again, not to sound callous, but so? I don't hear pro-life movement or right-wingers telling couples who have genetic health problems not to reproduce. I don't hear them moralizing those people. Like the prior argument, these are ethical considerations that should be made between the couple, and I think it's wrong that we attempt to moralize these considerations. The process requires sinful acts. This is another argument I see with some frequency, and honestly I think it's one of the weakest. The people making this point often cite the sin of onanism being required for IVF, and I'm not going to explain onanism here, but if you don't know, you have a Google machine. And this is weak because it proves that the person making this argument hasn't really done much research at all. IVF is an expansive form of treatment that addresses a whole host of different kinds of infertility. In cases of male factor infertility, the required materials are surgically removed. Nobody's onaning himself in that scenario. And in cases of female factor infertility, without getting graphic, you guys do realize that husbands and wives can do things together as a married couple? Or are we now actually policing what goes on in the bedroom between husbands and wives? Have we just confirmed that stereotype of Christians and conservatives? Sure, if you want to get really, really, really into it, that can and has been happening in a lot of cases of how IVF is done. But again, it's not something you can address in calling for reform. It defies the will of God. Is that even possible? Is it even possible to skirt the sovereign will of God? If you believe God is in control of everything, if nothing happens without his action and permission, if you believe that all things are threads being woven together in God's divine tapestry, and that he is the ultimate giver of life, and IVF is a defiant action against his sovereignty, then nobody would have ever been born out of IVF. A lot of people making these kinds of arguments believe God, in his sovereignty, uses means to work his will. And my counter argument is, aren't medical procedures means by which and through which he works? People should just consider adoption instead. This is often the last argument I see being made after every argument prior has been addressed. If you're struggling to conceive naturally, you should just adopt. Just adopt. I'm not saying that that's a bad or wrong consideration for a lot of couples. In fact, I think that's a very good, very noble option for a lot of people. But it's not really an argument against IVF, especially if you've taken my position where you argue for its reform, so it's done morally. A lot of people, for some reason, think that adoption is somehow the solution to infertility. And it's not. And that's what this whole discussion around IVF should be orbiting around. The group of people most reliant upon these kinds of treatment seem to be the least considered group in the arguments being made against these kinds of treatments. As I've stated before, in its current form, there is a lot wrong with IVF. A lot of lives are destroyed through the treatment and the way it's currently being done. And I agree, that shouldn't happen. But just because certain aspects are wrong, just because a lot of people are abusing the treatment, I feel like I've seen a lot of laziness in parsing through this issue. We don't want to get into the nitty-gritty. We just look at the big picture, see that the treatment has a lot of problems, a lot of abuse, and go, nah, it's all bad, just get rid of the whole thing. I kind of look at it in a similar way to things like chemotherapy. It's a really intense treatment, extremely involved, really difficult. Nobody who has to go through with it wants to go through with it. And there are ethical considerations that should be made prior to undergoing these kinds of treatments. Chemo is really hard on your body. In many cases, you're irradiating parts of your body, doing your body immense harm. And under normal circumstances, doing harm to your body is immoral. But in cases where chemotherapy is necessary, it's not. We don't call that immoral. Under normal circumstances, a loving husband and wife who want children and have children, we say that's morally good. We don't say that's immoral. And under a reformed system like the one I've detailed many times already in this video, I don't think that that can be called immoral either, which is why I don't align myself with the abolitionists. Now, two words I've brought up this entire video are the terms moral and ethical. I think those terms can be conflated. They're very easily conflated because they mean similar things, but they're not identical in meaning. Some things can be ethical without being moral, and some things can be moral without being ethical. If IVF is reformed, I believe it can be done morally, or at the very least, it is morally neutral. But is it ethically neutral? That, I don't know. And that's why I believe if there are arguments to be made against reform and for total banning of IVF, the arguments are ethical ones. We don't fully understand everything about conception. There are reasons still unknown to us why the egg and particular sperm cell come together in the process of natural reproduction. And in an external environment where the sperm and egg are introduced unnaturally, artificially, there are a lot of things at play that we don't know, we don't understand, and we can't see just looking at it from under a microscope. We don't know what they are, but they're likely the reasons for why health risks are elevated in children conceived through this treatment. Now, is it good and moral that children are born? Undoubtedly, yes. I don't think you would find very many sane people who would argue against that. Even if children are born with deformities or ailments, it's still good that they are alive. And being born perfect is not a prerequisite to having moral worth as a human being. But, on the other hand, is it ethical to make the choice to conceive a child who has an elevated risk of health problems? That I don't know. I know it's unethical and immoral to end the life of a child who isn't a perfect specimen, but that's not the question I asked. And that's maybe one of the reasons I think I don't see a ton of pro-lifers putting out these kinds of questions from an ethics standpoint. It's because it then has a ton of implications for couples who can naturally conceive, but who are naturally at an elevated risk of passing on some kind of genetic health issues. And then this whole thing becomes very eugenicsy. And ethical questions are also probably ones that need to be considered on a case-by-case basis. It's going to be different for every couple. And at the end of the day, under ethical considerations, it's not really up to us morally, and it probably shouldn't be, who does and does not have children. And don't confuse what I just said. I didn't say who does and does not abort their children. You can still be against that and be for IVF being reformed rather than abolished. And I think that's pretty consistent. Being pro-life also includes being pro-life. IVF is not a cure for infertility, even if it were done the way I wish it were done. Just like chemotherapy is not a cure for cancer. In an ideal world, we wouldn't need things like chemotherapy or fertility treatments. But we are not in an ideal world. And until we can find a cure for these ailments, or a way to treat them that has fewer moral and ethical questions, I think it's wrong to deprive people of these treatments if they're in a position where they need them. We wouldn't call for a total ban of medical administration of painkillers just because people abuse heroin. Our problem with drugs is when they are misused, and I think that's a similar thing going on with IVF. The reality is we are in a world with a lot of problems, a lot of complicated issues, and it's important to consider that from as many angles as possible when you're arguing for or against certain policies, practices, procedures, ideas, etc. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Hopefully I've articulated my thoughts properly and clearly, but I would love to know what you think. Is there anything that I'm not considering, or maybe I'm misunderstanding something? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Start a discussion. I think everyone who wants to have an opinion on this topic should be as informed as possible. As always, if you enjoy my content and want to see more, I would really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Hope you're all having a fantastic day, and I will see y'all next time.